Hey y'all,
What's going on, everyone?
I'm Jay,
Now I'm Chris the Bird Nerd,
and we
and we
are
are
the
the
Bird
Bird Brain.
Brains. How did that sound for you, Zach? Were we off or
Cha
were we
cha.
on?
It's actually pretty matched up. Yeah.
Okay, it was off for me, so we always talk about that.
Thanks for being nice,
Yeah,
Zach.
so we've got uh Dr. Zach Bell with us. I guess what if I was going to say your title it would be like neuroscientist,
I call myself a
molecular.
biologist these days
Yeah.
because I do a little bit of everything. So yeah.
Yeah, okay, just a biologist, right? So,
Yeah.
doctor of biology, Zach Bell, f live or I guess recorded for you from Okinawa, Japan. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. Bird Brains, Bird Brains. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. The Bird Brains Podcast with Chris and Jay. Bird Brains, Bird Brains. If you didn't catch the first part of this chat, go back to Chris's channel and we've got part
Yeah.
one. Before we get into part two, quick plug. Chris, you want to do it? You want to do New Zealand?
Yeah. Yeah. Let's do a shout out to our sponsors, New Zealand. Uh, Super grateful for them. We actually, Jay and I, we just got some products, so probably in these upcoming videos, we'll highlight some more of their products. But if you haven't already, go on to newzealand.com, check out their catalog, look at the bird products that they have. Everything from your large parrots down to your small finches, the zebra finch, as Dr. Bell calls them, and we'll probably be talking a little bit more about them in this upcoming video. But go on, we got 10% off if you use the code BirdBrains at New Zealand, so that you guys can get some products. And if you haven't already, go in and look at the Bird Brains Perch Box subscriptions. Sign up for those monthly. Get products sent to you every month, and enrichment items, seed, nutritional aspects, breeding aspects, all sent to your doorstep on a monthly basis. So it's a pretty cool deal, and get some awesome stuff in those boxes. So thanks, New Zealand. Shout out to you guys, and go check them out.
Absolutely. All right. So in the first half, we touched on a lot of things. We talked about song development. We talked a little bit about why zebra finches are used for research. We talked turtles some. Zach's nonprofit, the Okinawa Kame Center, the Okinawa Turtle Center. For those of you who don't speak Japanese, I do not. Um, but
That makes two of us.
yeah,
It makes three
and
of us, baby.
yeah, I bet you're closer than we are. So.
Yes.
Man,
We've just exhausted my Japanese knowledge right there. I've said the three things that I can say. So, in this episode, we thought we'd talk about we kind of just keep that conversation going. But as Zach just said off camera, we thought we'd talk a little bit of neuroanatomy, which if you can spell that without using spell check, high five to you. But so I was talking with Zach, and this is a very layperson understanding, right? I have a degree in history, so I can teach you the history of smart people who can do science. Um, but so if you look at like the human brain, right, roughly the size of my, two fists together in your head, and the hippocampus is about 10% of that mass. And that's where that phrase, you only use 10% of your brain comes from. So your higher thought function, your personality and everything is in the hippocampus. It's my understanding. And I'm trying to get Einstein to come over here so I can make my point, but of course the one time he doesn't want to come over here. So if you just take just one half of my brain, it's much larger than Einstein's whole head, right? Einstein's brain is like yay big. So how do birds like Einstein or even the smaller birds like the finches whose brain is quite
Yeah.
smaller get to a level of intelligence like we have? And a different biologist that I discussed this with was basically explaining it's sort of the difference between like a naturally aspirated V8 or a turbocharged four cylinder. So birds, even though their whole brain mass is smaller, their hippocampus makes up like 50% of their total brain mass. So instead of getting there with a big brain and a small hippocampus, they're getting there with a small brain and a relatively large hippocampus to get there. And so I was wondering, did y'all
That was very
research?
educational, Jay.
Yeah.
I,
I
I
listen when
learned
people
something
talk.
there. Thanks, man.
Yeah, so it's one of my favorite ways to explain, like, people, because I get asked all the time, like, how smart is he? And it's like real smart, right? Like problem solving, tool using smart. So my question to you is, with zebra finches, with songbirds, maybe even with your turtles, have you seen, does that kind of play out, into the non-citizens? Do you see that in passerines at all? Or have you done that research, or does somebody need to do it, or what?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think when you're relating to intelligence, I think like the ability to learn, problem solve, vocal learning, and I think that's maybe a good starting point, to talk about the neuroanatomy. So if you look across the animal kingdom, a lot of animals, especially vertebrates, make vocalizations, right? Sighs, calls, moans, howls, you name it, right? The reflexive types of sounds. So these are just auditory responses. And you also have animals just like your pet dog that are auditory learners, right? The dog can learn to sit. Even your bird can learn different actions without actually being able to maybe replicate it. So there's auditory learners, but then there's maybe another category which is called vocal learning. And vocal learning or vocal imitation learning is really when an animal can hear something, store it in their brain, and practice it and can repeat it. And if you look across the animal kingdom, it's very rare. And
Yeah.
so even our closest living ancestor or closest living relatives, non-human primates, they cannot do this. So why is it that a bird can be a vocal learner, but a chimpanzee cannot? And it depends on how we're measuring intelligence. So if we say that vocal learning is our metric, well, how many vocal learners exist in the animal kingdom? And you have something like whales and dolphins, so your cetaceans. You have seals, some bats, and then elephants. And those are really the only vocal learners outside of the birds. But interestingly, in the birds, we have three different types. We have the parrots, we have hummingbirds, and then we have the songbirds. And so when you can ask the question, is this, did all organisms have this sort of, or vertebrates have the ability to imitate song and they just all lost it except for these five? Or did it evolve five separate times through evolutionary history? And the evidence is pretty much suggesting it's an evolved function that's just come out multiple times. Same way flight has evolved multiple times throughout evolutionary history. It's not, they're not, we didn't all lose flight. It's just sort of, there was selective pressures for this in a given environment. And so if we're talking about that as a metric of intelligence, how does that work, right? How does the brain compute that? And you mentioned about the hippocampus. I don't recall knowing too much about hippocampus and sort of song learning as much as maybe in mammals, because the hippocampus in birds, at least how it was defined as I remember, is actually quite small, but there's these other structures in the brain that are quite large that are sort of that are part of the song system. So as I mentioned, there's the process of learning song, so you have to be able to hear song. So there's discrete cells in the brain that allow for
Uh,
information to go through the ears and go into the brain. And then you have another system that sort of connects to that in a way that allows you to produce a sound. So there's a vocal output. So there's input, output. And what the songbirds have is this sort of recursive loop of cells that allow them to practice the song. And scientists know this because they've went in and damaged that part. Or they can, I've even seen clever experiments where they've actually, because of the biophysical properties of neurons, you can actually cool them down. So then, well, what does these neurons do? Well, you cool it down. Now the bird sings really slowly, and so the
it's
circuitry is
amazing.
quite well understood. But the cytoarchitecture or the cellular structure of birds are quite interesting and unique from the other vocal learners, and even from humans. Humans, we've been able to pack in a lot of brain tissue because of all these folds. I'm sure you've seen a human brain before, all these folds in the brain. This basically allows you more surface area. What birds have done is reduce the amount of space in between those cells, so they're typically more compact and they're more interconnected. compared to other vertebrates and other vocal learners. That seems one of the tricks that birds have done, and they've had to do this because the birds have to fly. The brain can't get so big. They have to be able to fly. And another simple one is they're bipedal. These birds have to be able to walk around and take off. They can't have this big brain moving around. Yeah.
Right. Well, and then it's like I used to, it's a really nerdy thing that I did with Shocker, but like, you at Thanksgiving, you go around and everybody says what they're thankful for, which if you're not from the United States, it's a holiday that you basically are what you're thankful for in the year, right? So I'd always say I'm thankful for the Foreman Magnum, which I thought it was funny because if you're not a scientist and you don't know what it means, which I learned it in anthropology, it sounds like you're saying something dirty. But so like teenage me thought that was funny. But the foramen magnum is where your spinal cord and your skull meet. And the main reason that we're able to have such a large brain and walk upright is because, like, if you think of like a dog skull or any really most of your mammals, it attaches on the back of the head. We attach on the bottom, and that allows us to one, walk upright, and two, if you think about it, if we had to walk around like this all day, your neck would get
Yeah.
really sore. But because we're holding it vertically, we can hold that weight more, and that developed, and then that allowed our brain to get bigger, and then eventually we became, man. And so if you look at like the missing links that are not missing anymore,
Yeah.
you'll see that the foramen magnum basically rotate from the back down to there. And so even Einstein, his spinal cord attaches back here, right? But just like all the other things that birds have done, that would make sense because you have like hollow bones, you have all these other mechanisms, like down feathers instead of body fat in
Mm.
order to
You're as light
maintain.
as can be.
And like even another thing in this realm, I've noticed if you watch, especially with finches, it's really noticeable. They often poop right when they take off, especially if you scare them.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
it's
Yep.
like a fire plane dumping its extra fuel tanks before it dogfights, right? It's like, oh, I gotta get out of here. And it,
Propulsion.
well, it's a reflex to dump the weight, right? If you only weigh
Yeah.
9 grams, that little one third of a gram of poop, that's a lot of weight. So you might as well dump
Yeah.
that before you go try to get away. So
Yeah.
yeah, all these things that I mean,
I need
birds.
to practice that.
Yeah, birds are. We could have a long conversation, the three of
You,
us, about how awesome birds are.
Jay, one angle that I could take from that too, talking about the hippocampus and that, it's larger for the birds. They have the ability to adapt to songs and even like hand gestures, things like that. If you're looking at, your parrots, that they're very intelligent birds and they can learn a lot. They have good memories, right? They remember bad experiences, they remember good experiences. That's why it's important to properly train these animals. And in it's almost similar to a toddler. When they do something that you don't like or don't agree with, instead of punishing them in a way that you know damages that memory, right? You try to enhance the good behavior and not the poor behaviors, right? But so that they can learn and grow from that. But I also look at the importance of enrichment activities for your birds, right? Because of that development. And that's for your smallest birds, your African waxbills, your gold breast waxbills, all the way up to your macaws. But that enrichment is key, right? Not only for learning, but for exercise, for exercising the brain and the body. All those activities um, really are key players. You think of them just sitting in this little cage with very little enrichment. Their quality of life is going to go down quite a bit. Their health becomes poor faster, right? So that's really important and key, and just kind of something that triggered me on that side as we're talking about some of these um, attributes or keys that these birds have. I think was pretty cool, and just the importance of encouraging that, whether it's a foraging activity or an exercise activity or a training activity, constantly providing those enrichment opportunities for your birds, big and small, as it goes a long way in that brain development, but then also in their overall health.
Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean,
go ahead, Zach.
No, I was just going to mention that, people who are maybe having different ideas for how they can enrich their own, birds, there's so many great documentaries now about zebra finches online. Like I watched like a 15-minute one where, you could see, oh, if I wanted to put this type of substrate or this size branches or these plants, you can really get after it. And there's also, this is sort of the Bible of the zebra finch world that we all have to like, read every day sometimes, it's called A Synthesis of Field and Laboratory Studies, but I highly recommend this book by Zahn. It's
Awesome.
basically tell you everything you need to know about how they are in the wild as well as some of the laboratory stuff, and it's a pretty thick book, and it's almost like you know, like a textbook in some ways. But this is one of these cool books that can help you as a captive keeper uh, to maybe enrich
I
your,
love that.
your your animals' lives.
I love that. It's like that's one that I don't have. You can see
I was
90% of
looking.
these books behind me are bird books,
Yeah.
and I've got a couple of my zebra finch books. It's kind of far away, but
Hmm.
sitting out here in front because I knew we would be talking about those. But I definitely am going to look into that because I enjoy learning as much as I can and try to mimic their wild environment as much as I possibly can as well, right? Because I want to be able to give them the best life possible, and that includes a good knowledge of where they're coming from, what they eat, their
Yeah.
activities, how they socialize, all of that to try and give them the best lives that I possibly can.
Yeah, Zach, I don't know. Have you seen our Dream Aviaries episode? The first one
Maybe
we
I
did?
haven't.
So it was a while ago. I mean, months ago, but we did an episode where we talked about, if we were, multi-billionaires, if we were Elon Musk or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, I heard that one.
What,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, I heard
And
that one.
so one of the things I mentioned in that is like, I would love to have an aviary that's large enough that I could have like microclimates. So I could have like the desert,
Yeah.
I could have like
Yeah.
the grasslands, I could have the triple canopy jungle, I could have the woodlands. I'd love to be able to do that. Obviously, don't have that space now, but one of the things I do try to do is kind of make like the nest boxes. I sort of try to aim. I know which species kind of tend towards which nest boxes. And then based on that, when I'm putting the nest boxes in, I sort of try to set it up so that like great examples like red throat pair finches, they like my mason jar nest box, but they also like a really heavily planted, like jungly thing.
Yeah.
So I try to make sure some of those kind of get back in a corner with some fake vines in front of them. And then
Yeah.
invariably, that's the one they'll select. So,
That's
I
nice.
do try to do that. Um,
Yeah, it's
And then you
very
hide their
cool.
nesting material all throughout the aviary in different toys or things. I mean, that's the enrichment
right.
part, right? That we talked about earlier. Now they're actually foraging for nesting material and for food. It's not just one location every time and they're a robot every day, right? You mix it up
Yeah.
and change branches around. All that stuff is super important and key.
It,
So, yeah, my question for you, Zach, the next one I had was, what is, having done the research, kept zebra finches, obviously a significant amount of them in the research. So just out of curiosity, before we get to my main question, what's the number of birds you were dealing with at any one time?
yeah, so it depended on the experiments. So to keep, believe it or not, to keep an animal in a laboratory setting, there's all these fees associated with it. There's somebody who comes and cleans and takes care of just the regular facility, somebody who feeds and waters them, somebody who is the veterinarian that's on staff. And so it averages out to be about, $1 per animal per day. And so when we would have colonies that were 200 birds in one room, and that's what we would do. We'd have free flight aviaries. It'd be a whole room. I'm bad with footage here, but maybe 4 meters by 4 meter type of size room, which is fairly large, big square with 200 birds in it. That's $200 a day. And so typically you'd have your sort of breeding aviary, and then when you wanted to do experiments, you would breed just enough that you would need to take them into a smaller aviary, and it's really just for being able to capture them quickly because all the birds are banded, with their own numbers. Is basically once they're hatchlings, and even once they're born, we're constantly increasing the size of the bands until they become adults. But once they go into, say, maybe an experimental room, I tried to keep between 20 and 30 birds, so it's still naturalistic, but it allowed me to be able to capture an animal for an experiment, especially if I'm looking for a single individual within the 30 birds. And it saved me time, but it's kind of what you're looking at in the from the husbandry side. It's not as naturalistic, right? It has to be practical, but it has to be, useful enough. So what we would do is we would buy, these organizational shelves that you see like in a shop where there's like a little plastic box that kind of hooks and you can
The
kind of organize
pegboard.
them.
Yeah.
Yeah, like, screws here, nails here. We would just set those up, all around, and the birds would use those as nest boxes. So we would always know whose eggs, because we would have a little title on there. So you just pick the box up, write them, weigh the chicks, and do an inspection, then hook it back, and then you're done. But other than that, the floor we would put down, different substrates that were natural. We'd put down all their food was on the ground, so they'd have to forage, which was actually quite hard because when we first, my supervisor and I, he's a guy from Georgia. I think you're from Georgia. I'm looking at your shirt here.
Go dogs.
You know, he and I both kind of came from the U.S. to go to London because he had taken this new position. And so this particular animal facility had never worked with birds before. So early on, they weren't refeeding the birds. They would see all the seed on the ground and assume they didn't need it. They didn't realize they're removing the husk. And so these animals are actually dropping in weight, and we're trying to figure out what's going on, what's happening. And it's because they don't know how to take care of birds yet. They're new to it. So there was a lot of trial and error, but from the experimental side, typically a couple hundred in a big free flight aviary. The breeding aviary is what we called it. And then we'd have a smaller experimental room, which was just a smaller version, but it was still, free flight aviary.
Okay, yeah. So Chris, how many zebra finches do you think you bred in your life or been around the breeding of?
Oh my gosh. Uh, Geez. Very high hundreds, if not low thousands
Wow.
Yeah,
throughout my life.
I'm in
And
the
my
same boat.
my dad had huge aviary flocks of zebra finches of between 50 and 100 adults, in those aviaries. And even just this last year, I bred, if I look at my phone, I think it was 48 zebra finches in the few pairs that I had. So, um, yeah,
The,
That's
they,
industrial level right there.
they are
That's
prolific.
research
Yeah,
level.
I was gonna say that. Yeah, I'm gonna say somewhere between 900 and 1200 for me. And
Wow.
like, yeah, I've got two pairs. I intentionally do not have more than two because they're so prolific. And
right.
I came up with north of 40 babies this year as well. So that pegboard idea is, I may steal that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's kind of
Uh-huh.
cool. I don't think
I
anybody
love
but
that.
zebras or societies would use it though. Diamond doves would use the top row. That might be
They
another
tend to like
bird
the
that's,
high ones.
yeah, yeah. Well, just as a general rule, bird instincts are go high, right? That's safety, right?
Hmm.
You can't, all the ground, they obviously have aerial predators also, but your snakes, your mice, your rats, raccoons, you name it, ants, everything that the majority of the things that eat baby nestling still in the nest birds come from the ground up. So
Mhm.
farther from the ground you can get, the safer your babies are, the more successful you're going to be, right? So,
Further from the ground and hidden in a bush or in a tree hollow from the air predators.
right. So here's my main question though, Zach. So you've done all the research, you've done all the clinical stuff. Do you have any things that you're like, man, I wonder X or I wonder Y or like I never got to I always wondered about this, but I never got to do it because it wasn't, in the test or whatever. Do you have any questions like that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I have tons of questions. A lot of interesting stuff happened as I was finishing up my PhD. There was a paper that came out from a group in Australia, and then my supervisor became involved with that group in Australia as well. But I don't know if you guys saw this. I mean, it made a lot of, it was quite popular in the press. But zebra finches singing to their eggs. Did you guys catch on to that?
No.
No, enlighten us.
Okay, so I mean that was an area that I'd always been kind of interested in development of the song system and all these aspects, but it became evident that the females, actually it wasn't the females, maybe it was the males. I can't remember. The parents, we'll just say the parents, one of them were flying back, and this was a field study where they noticed that they're singing to the eggs, and it's a different song. It's not the courtship song, and it's not some of these other. It's some this unique vocalization, and it's like, wow, what's that about? And so they started to study the babies, and they realized when the babies were sung this particular song, they would grow up to be smaller, and they would also have more offspring compared to ones who didn't hear the song. And they did this experimentally in a laboratory where they, took eggs from a pile and they played them, with a speaker, this song versus a control song, which is just, a regular song. And then they would mix the eggs up and put them in a with a surrogate family, essentially, a fostering family. They'd raise up these chicks, and some would be big and some would be small. And the main point was that they were singing a song related to the climate change. In a hotter environment, these animals will sing this particular song as a cue in the genomics, in the whole genome of these developing eggs to be smaller, because it's a harsh world out there, it's hotter environment, and if you're smaller in a hotter environment, you dissipate heat better. That's the just so story here. But that was an area that I was really fascinated in, that if I could go back and do work in this sort of prenatal song stuff,
That is
I would like to
crazy.
do it.
So I have noticed a version of that then. So this is kind of one of those things where like now that you've said it now, I'm like, okay, yeah. So I don't know about whether they've done this by song, but I do notice. So my birds, the zebras specifically, do adjust their clutch sizes throughout the breeding season. So I typically breed from late February, March to October. And so typically my zebra finches in that time will do 3 or 4 clutches. So
Hmm.
I notice usually the big clutches are clutch 1 and clutch 3, and the smaller ones are clutch 2 and clutch 4. And so clutch 1, and I wait for temperature, but clutch 1, usually my zebra finches are like the first to lay down, like lay their eggs. So like if I put the nest boxes in on Monday, dad zebra finch, by the time Tuesday morning rolls around, that nest box
He's
is
then doing
built.
this little call to the female to
Yeah,
get her to come in.
and they've done the deed, and eggs are, it's within 48 hours we're on the first or even the second egg. And so I've noticed it from a competition standpoint in the aviary. It's kind of a race, and they're like, even though I make a big point of, especially during the breeding season, that they don't run out of food, they don't run out of water, they don't run out of millet, they don't run out of egg food, because I don't want to, I'm trying for bigger clutches, right? I want more
Yeah,
birds. So but they will, by the time clutch 2 rolls around, typically they already have babies that have fledged, and all the other birds are starting to fledge babies. And so the competition for space, for food, for everything has
yeah,
heated up. And
yeah,
so then so the first clutch, I typically see anywhere from like 5 to as many as 9 babies. Second clutch, I'll see 3 to 4, 2 to 4. Third clutch will go back to that big clutch because they tend to go fast. So pretty much as soon as, clutch 1 is fledged, they're laying clutch 2, whereas some of the other birds won't start again until babies are weaned and off on their
Yeah.
own. Zebra finches, no such compunction. So then it tends to end up that clutch 3 sort of catches everybody else in a window where their babies are pretty much all grown and removed, and the next ones aren't coming yet. And so you get another big clutch, and then by the time you get to clutch 4, you're into like September, October. The days are getting shorter, it's getting a little cooler,
yeah,
and then they've backed off again because they know, they're basically gonna squeak out a few more, but they know resources are going to be less, daylight's going to be less, everything. So I do notice that they adjust, the throttle of how many babies they're having based on when in the year it is.
And
it's
Jay,
fascinating.
one thing I've noticed too throughout the many years of breeding, and not just with zebra finches, but with majority of the finches that I've bred in the past, temperature, lighting, and food types and amount of food, I've seen huge influxes of male to female ratios. So usually when it's hotter, and lighting, so and I'll get into the lighting piece in a minute. The lighting, and then if not as many food resources available, I tend to get higher amounts of males. Now, this is just my experience, right? And I'm sure maybe someone's done some studies out there, but That's usually when I get higher amounts of males in my offspring, and that's consistent with my lady Goulians. That's consistent with my shaft tails, zebra finches, star finches. Um, I've noticed when temperatures are optimal. So we're looking, between that 70 and 85-degree range seems to be a pretty good sweet spot for the birds. And if I'm
Interesting.
at producing tons of extra food, egg food and different varieties of seeds, things like that. And if I put in brand new lighting, so most of the lights I use are LED lights, right? And then they can go out into the aviary to get natural sunlight. I usually get a better 50-50 ratio of male to female. So I have heard theories of black lights with Lady Goulian finches. If you add a black light in with the lighting, then you will tend to get more female than male offspring. I don't know if that theory is proven true. I've never added a black light in there, but I've heard of lots of breeders in the past that have done that and have had success. So yeah, I think there's definitely some factors there that play a role in what gender of offspring you get. And I don't know if the birds determine that or the outer climate controls determine that. So, but not sure there, but definitely something that I experience. I tend to midsummer get a lot of males, and end of summertime, fall time, I get more females, or a better 50-50% ratio with my temps cooling off. So it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, I'd say that that tracks too with the bigger clutches tend to be either 50-50 or even like 60-40 female, and the smaller ones tend to be like 75-25 male. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Chris, do you see the same sort of fluctuation, or do you let yours breed 4 cycles, like Jay?
Yeah. I don't have as long of a breeding period for
Yeah, I see.
like Jay does, just with my cold springs and cold winters, or, fall and winter are pretty much the same thing. We usually have about a month of fall and then it's pretty cold. So good portion of my birds cool off. So I'm more 2 to 3 clutches. I do this year I didn't, but I do try to breed throughout the wintertime inside my shed, not out in the aviary. So if I have that, then that does expand the ratios. But that's where the wintertime I tend to get a little bit more female because I'm actually trying to heat the shed so it's cooler
I see.
in there during breeding season. And I'm producing more artificial light than sunlight, right? Because the sun's setting at 5:30 p.m. and not rising until 7 a.m., right? So the birds are not getting as much natural sunlight coming through.
Very interesting. And Chris, you also having these sex ratio differences. And you mentioned there was like 2 big cycles. Are the sex ratios roughly the same at both of those? Or I'm sorry, Jay, the sexes are 50-50 at the 2 big peaks, or you see a sway for one sex to the other?
Yeah, I'd say the big peaks I'm seeing even like female heavy. So it seems to be like it seems to all kind of come down to you amalgamate all this, right? More daylight, good temperature, more resources. Seems like when they feel like they're, and then also I think a big component also is just like the amount of space available in the aviary. So like I try to once the babies have weaned fairly shortly thereafter. So you're talking about me, hatch plus 4 or 5 weeks, 6 weeks. Depending on species, like your shaft tails, your Gouldians, I tend to leave longer. But like zebra finches, as soon as they're weaned, I'll pull them, primarily for space reasons, but also because dad and especially boy chicks don't get along.
Yeah.
Um, but it seems to me to be like, and I know coyotes do this too, is like resource dependent. So like if they have the room and they have the resources, you'll get bigger clutches with more hens. And if they have less resources, less room, less whatever, they tend to go more male heavy. And it seems to me to be like a kind of a built-in, the population
Yeah.
is growing or shrinking to fit the available
Resources.
resources. Yeah, right. Because I mean, all you really
Yeah.
need is, hens is basically what dictates population growth, right? You really only need one cockbird, as long as no everybody's not related. But the So if you make more males, you just the most fit males will breed. If you make more hens, everybody will breed, right?
Yeah.
It's actually very interesting. I wonder, as there's a song for, hotter climates to produce a particular type of offspring. Maybe there's a similar thing, right? There's a song that they
Yeah.
sing to make a
Yeah.
smaller clutch size, as you're kind of referencing.
Yeah.
So
Right.
Yeah.
I'm
Totally.
wondering about it in reverse too. Like, is it kind of
yeah,
like different speed dial buttons, right? So like,
yeah,
do they hit them with something else to say, hey, everybody hatch, you know? So,
yeah. I mean, it is a this idea of group hatching. People see it in different types of like turtles. So I know some sea turtles do it, but also some freshwater turtles where there's I think people put in like microphones, but as soon as one starts to hatch, it's just a chain reaction, and then all of a sudden the whole beach comes alive of
Yep.
this
Hmm.
ideal conditions. But it might not necessarily be some maybe one only. It only takes one environmental cue signal for one to hatch, but once they all start to hatch, it's really the hatching is related to the other ones, not necessarily you
And
know.
and I see that, finches and parrots, because they typically lay an egg a day. So you'll see a staggered hatching
Mhm.
unless the female lays all of her eggs and then starts to incubate. Uh, One thing I notice in quails, pheasants, that a similar trait like that, once one chick hatches, within 12 hours, all the rest of your eggs are hatching very similar times. So it is kind of like a trigger hatch for those species. I don't know so much in the finch and parrot world, just because usually their eggs are staggered when they lay them, and then they're incubating the eggs as they're laying an egg a day. So they tend to hatch out a day apart in most species, not all. Zebra finches probably do a fairly decent job. I think for the majority of their clutches, they usually, if they lay six eggs, those six eggs are hatching out within 1 to 3 days time. But yeah, your quails and pheasants, a lot of your ground birds, similar traits there. That one chick comes out and it triggers the rest of those eggs to start hatching.
well, and two things here. So one, I think, and we've talked about this before, like the hens tend to learn, right? They get more experience and they figure out
Yeah.
that
Yep.
if they stagger the hatch, chick number one always makes it. Chick number five almost never does, right? If they're and so they, but then I mean, at some point you're getting to like a K. I think it's the K type reproductive strategy, right? Where I can't remember which type. It's the opposite of what humans are. Humans might be K. So there's two kinds, and I can't remember which is which. But
I have to look it
there's
up.
there's the type where like all the primates are like this too, right? So we have one baby. Elephants do this. We have one baby fairly infrequently, and we nurture it for a really long time.
Uh-huh.
Whereas a lot of like your prey animals everybody drops it once and
Yeah,
it's a math equation, right? It's like I'm gonna have
yeah,
100,000
Yeah.
babies and these foxes can only eat 10,000 and 90,000
yeah,
are gonna make it, right? So
yeah.
I think there's certainly a lot of that, like in the finch world, right? You have there's a bunch of different things, but it's tied to the seasons and everything else, but you tend to have like massive hatches. And that's most birds
Yeah.
where pretty much all the babies are going to be roughly the same age, right? Within a few months of each other for that year. And then it's going to be between that and the next year, you're going to have like 9 to 12 months, right, of age gap. And then you're going to have another big chunk and then another big gap. So, like, if you wanted to eliminate zebra finches, if you could, right after that last big hatch, if you killed all of them, you know, you would never there'd never be a clutch that would hatch out some other time. So
I see what you're doing.
I wonder if that's part of it. I mean, yeah, I mean, I have noticed that with my quail, and some of them seem to even hatch like early. Like you have, they're precocial, right? So they come out ready to walk around and eat and everything, but some seem like a little bit less well done in the egg, if that makes sense. I wonder
Yeah.
the experiment, I guess, would be to like if you just when they were close to being able to hatch, right? I think quail incubate what, 19 days, Chris, for the button quail or 21?
Yeah, 17 to 19 for button quail, and
That's
then your
right.
larger quails and pheasants are 21 to 30 days,
Yeah.
depending on the
So,
species.
so call it if you went on day 17 and you just started cracking eggshells. around the eggs, would they all start to pip and hatch? I wonder.
Yeah,
That'd be a fairly easy experiment to do.
Yeah, and I do know that quails, they sing to their eggs. The moms
interesting.
have a distinct call that they use while sitting on their eggs, which then when their chicks hatch, they recognize that call as their mom.
That's
And
the
usually the first,
come get under me call. Yeah.
yeah, and so that is something that is specific to a lot of the quails and pheasants is the mothers in particular have a distinct call for their chicks, and they will do that call, imitate that call while the chicks are still in the eggs and they can hear, and then it's a sound that they're familiar to once they hatch out.
Very fascinating. Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why birds sort of drew me in. I've been interested in reptiles and even, including turtles, obviously, but the maternal care of the finches was just crazy, right? These animals pair bond, and then they sort of take care of these babies, and they do it generation after generation, and it's just so human-like for me. Obviously I'm anthropomorphizing, but I just sort of see why they're so interesting, why so many people become fascinated with them in the hobby because of these sort of parallels. It's very fascinating.
And one thing with that, Zach, is that I think can be harder for people, and maybe it's a part of the reptilian brain, I don't know, but if circumstances go awry, more times than not, those birds will abandon the nest or they'll toss the chicks. And it's really to save themselves
Yeah.
in most cases. And so sometimes that's hard for people to see and realize, like, why would you kill your own baby? But it is a survival tactic, and obviously those survival tactics still are in play in
Yeah.
captivity, right? They don't understand that we're not here to hurt them. They see it as a threat, and if circumstances aren't optimal, they will, choose to either abandon the nest altogether and just let the chicks die in the nest, or they'll toss them out to kind of take the predators away from their nesting site.
Or even, like if you have a big nutrition cut midway through
Yeah.
incubation, they'll eat the eggs.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean that's these types of behavior. I mean, you see it in not just birds, but yeah, it's fascinating how the general idea I think is that you know if I die as the parent, I can never reproduce. So it makes sense to
Right.
sacrifice the young because I can always make another one, right? It doesn't make any sense for me to sacrifice my life for something that might not live, but it's one of these harsh realities.
Right. Well,
Right.
and
Yeah.
we
Whereas the human brain says,
Yeah,
I'll die instead. Let my
yeah,
child live." Right.
right. Well, yeah, but the odds, right? So that's what we talked about, that reproductive strategy. So like the even with great parental care, the wild finch, just to sexual maturity, which is only like, you know, 4 to 6 months from hatch, is like 5% survival rate, somewhere in there. Is the last time I read the numbers. So like it humans we're way, we're like, especially nowadays with the lack of infant mortality and everything, we're like almost 100%,
Right.
right? Like
yep,
so it makes a lot more sense for us to say, no, I've invested, 8, 9 years of capital raising this kid. I've already
Right.
reproduced. Like, it makes more sense to save the
mm,
kid. Whereas birds are like, look, I can fly away. This snake can eat these babies, and I'll be laying more eggs tomorrow. And
yeah,
I'm already an adult that can successfully reproduce, and the odds of any of these babies making it are super slim anyway.
Right.
So yeah, it makes sense, but that's a hard lesson for a lot of bird keepers to learn. They make a mistake or they stress their birds out, and then the next thing you know, bye bye babies, and they feel so guilty.
Usually not the case for zebra finches, but some of your other finches, yes, that is a harsh reality.
Yeah,
Do
that's
you,
what.
do you guys?
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to. Do you ever see any of your finches or any of the species you work with, where maybe an older brother or older sister helps out with mom and dad to take care of the new babies?
All
All
the
the time.
time.
Very
Yeah.
cool.
And surprisingly, African species, I've seen more times than not in the African species, which are a lot harder to breed and successfully get young to the perch. Many times, if you do, I'll see those siblings helping out with the next clutch. I mean, they're very young still, right? They're only a few months old and they're still helping out with the next clutch. But yeah, society finches, zebra finches, a good portion of your finch species, I have seen that behavior in, and
Very cool.
they've got some strong maternal drive there, even at a young age to feed siblings.
Yeah, and I've also seen it even like so some species, so like I wouldn't even necessarily consider zebra finches in this category. I mean, they are a bit of a flock bird, but the males are they're a little bit more um reluctant than some of my species. So like my spice finches or like my shaft tails, for instance, like or even your society finches, they will all like it's very normal for me to see all like the whole Pophelia genus, which I have two of the three members right now, is your mask grass finches and your shaft tails finches. Um, they are pretty much always together. So like I have six shaft tails right now. Very weird for me to see like four here, two here. They're typically all in the same, square
Hmm.
meter area. And I've often seen them feed each other's babies also. So it's like
Yeah.
if I have both of
That's
them
really
have a
interesting.
clutch of like four or five each and there's 10 or 12 babies and I know who belongs to who, often they'll just feed whichever babies beg for food. And I'm
Yep.
watching, I'm like, I know that's not your dad.
Yeah.
And they're
I've
just sort of lined
yeah.
up feeding everybody.
I've seen that with my Amadina finches. They're an African species, and I've watched a single female feed a Lady Goulian chick, a shaft-tail chick, and a zebra chick.
Wow.
Didn't come from her nest. Like, she had no involvement while they were in the nest, and they fledged and were begging for food, and she's fed them. It's crazy. And the other parents, the actual parents, still feed them, but she's just kind of like the substitute of like, oh, you're still hungry? Sure, I'll jump in and take care of it. It's crazy. It just baffles me.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's any interesting like social games that they're playing. There's
Yeah.
evidence in other animals where there's like again, I don't know enough about the finches as a whole, but in like bats, for example, there's like communal nests where
Hmm.
everybody's babies are there, and then all the females go out and they go out and I think it's the moms. They go out and they get the blood from the cow or something, right? They kind of bite some mammal, anesthetize the area, and then they start to suck the blood up. But they're filling up some like throat sac of blood, and then they fly back in and they feed all the babies just a little bit of blood. This is sort of how they're trying to be good moms. But scientists have shown that if you actually net one of these females flying off to get some blood, and you just like take a syringe of air and just kind of like pump up her throat sac so it looks really full, and then you throw her back into the cave, all the other females watch and they say, that's interesting. She's not feeding our babies. And then the next time they go out and they collect blood, they'll feed everybody's baby except for hers. So they're keeping track of
Really?
whose baby's who.
Wow.
And I'm
Wow.
curious if the finches do something similar like this in these more communal systems.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know would be the I don't think so. If anything, like
Haven't observed much of that, but
yeah, I mean, have you seen? I mean, you've seen it with zebras. Have you seen the babies begging for food? I'm sure you
Yeah, I mean,
have.
I assume that zebras aren't probably in this category. I assume that there might be better examples out there because the zebra
Right.
finches are.
Yeah, but as far as like the act of like so like that whole like some species are even like my doves will put a wing over their parents and whack them on the back of the head till they feed them. So
yeah.
I often
Oh.
wonder if it's just like a you're annoying, so fine, here's some food and you'll shut up.
I think so
Um,
as well. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
if there's
It's
that
very much
aspect.
like instinct. I mean, it's like
I
a human, right? I'll pick up anybody's baby if it's crying on the ground and I find it, right? It's like, oh, what do I do? I'm trying
Yeah.
to calm it. So I assume
I'd
it's something
be
similar.
I'd be interested to see. There are some species of birds that are large flock breeding birds. You got your weavers. The weavers will build a huge community nest. I mean, they all each individually have their holes, but I don't know if there's some traits there of
Yeah.
some community feeding. Quaker parrots also build a really large community nest as well. So I'd be interested. I mean, I don't know because I've never kept those species or observed them. I'd be interested to see if maybe there are some species of birds out there that do that, but I would probably say overall for the finch species, no, and it's probably more like jay. I do think there are some maternal instincts in there, but probably not to the point of like I'm gonna feed your baby, so now you scratch my back when I have some chicks in the
Tit for
nest, and like
tat type stuff.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think it's more
I don't
lizard
think there's
brain
that.
of this is the hungry baby and I have food in my crop, so fine. Here you go.
Yeah,
Especially, and I bet you that it wouldn't happen if you were more resource limited. I think a
Yeah.
large part of it is like
right,
I'm 1 meter away from unlimited seed, so sure you can have some. I'll just swing back over and get some more.
right.
Very interesting.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we should cut this one here. I really would love to. We could go all night for this. No
Yeah,
problem. Zach, we will definitely have you back. Um,
incredibly intriguing.
please get back in the comments. Ask questions for the next time we have Dr. Bell on. Uh, you know, any observations you've seen, if any of the things we talked about resonate with what you're seeing with your birds, with your aviary, let us know. Um, Zach, do you want to tell everybody, and we'll link them below, but what you've got going on now with the turtles?
Absolutely, yeah. So if people want to learn more about what I currently do, which isn't with birds, I work with turtles now, but we're doing some conservation with a very rare species. It's about the size of an iPhone, so a very small forest-dwelling species that's
Wow.
endangered and being sort of smuggled into the wild or into the pet trade. So we're trying to do some conservation work in the forest, but while we're there trying to do conservation with turtles, we see all the animals, including the songbirds. So if you want to learn more about our conservation work, please see our links and learn more. And reach out to me if you're interested to talk about it.
And can they donate
Awesome.
too? It's a
Yeah,
nonprofit,
there's
right?
there's a way to donate on there as well. There's an app called Syncables, which is just you put in your credit card information. You can one-time click, and sometimes people want to donate gear, so they just buy something on Amazon and ship it to the house, which we're happy with that as well.
All
Field
right.
gear.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you get a chance as a thank you, Bird Brains listeners, for Dr. Zach Bell and his time, please hop over there and drop a couple bucks on the Turtle Center. We like reptiles around here
Yeah.
too.
Yes, please.
Um,
Absolutely.
as usual, you can find Chris and I on Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, etc. If you have questions, we really appreciate it. Don't forget to go to New Zealand, use code BirdBrains, 10% off, and I think that's it. And we'll catch you all in the next
Yep.
one.
Thanks, Dr. Bell, for your time. Appreciate you.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
See
both.
you guys.